Whether religious, spiritual, atheist, or secular, one of the biggest challenges we have in modern Western culture is our dualism between light and dark. Now, this does stem from our religious and spiritual history, whether we're aware of it or not. In essence, we have an oversimplification when it comes to these forces. In many senses, we try and deny darkness and live in the light entirely. That would be a very simplistic reading of religious teaching that's modelled in our contemporary culture. You see this all the time. The people who disagree with me are evil, which implies I'm in the light, and so on. I think the best criticism of this comes from Carl Jung. He wrote a lot about Western Christianity in particular, especially Protestantism, promoting this sense of do-gooders, if you will, the people who try and be holier than thou. And that process represses key parts of ourselves. By trying to be these ideal saintly characters, we deny some very true and often injured parts of ourselves and push them deep beneath. It's a very dangerous process, as you can imagine, because these things can then live in the waters deep beneath you and then creep out when you least expect it. Could be in the form of anger and addiction, a madness, whatever it may well be. And many of us suffer these things and don't even know why very often. Of course, we can understand the cultural models. This is replicated all the time in Western culture. Perhaps the most obvious example would be the Victorian era, famous for its propriety on the surface, following the rules. Everything's very uptight, draconian. But beneath that, there was a massive seedy underbelly that everybody was aware of. So while in polite society, you would make out you have this highly orderly, moral society, beneath that there was prostitution, crime, drugs, all sorts of darkness and disease. You can, of course, see that predicted in poems by William Blake, London being the most famous, just before the Victorian era, where he speaks about the harlot's curse that blasts the newborn infant's tear. What he's talking to there is how the men of the era will go around and have many whores. They will catch all sorts of diseases, bring that into the marriage bed, and their children are born with these diseases. Again, it's a manifestation, if you like, of the denial or a misunderstanding of the light-dark dynamic that leads to these things down the line. A more modern-day example of how we can sometimes misconstrue the light and the dark could be something like Star Wars. Now, I dare say many of you are fully aware of Star Wars. I'm a fan of it myself. And we all love the Force, if you do follow Star Wars. It's essentially the energy of life that Jedis on the light side can manipulate, or you should probably say flow with, in order to achieve superhuman feats and align with nature itself. Whereas the dark side of the Force, they would manipulate it for their own ends, for dark purposes and so on, and they are in this eternal battle. Now, in a way, this is a replication of the Christian foundational level understanding of morality. You have dark and you have light, and they're at battle with one another, and the light must overcome. Of course, many people like to see themselves as the Jedis and their opponents as the dark side, and so on. But I wouldn't say this is really understanding the true depth of nature, of real spirituality, and perhaps even life itself. This is why I'm interested in mysticism. It's why I'm interested in the different expressions of trying to understand this esoteric truth throughout time and space. And what that might talk to, that more mystical understanding, which you'll certainly get in Christian mysticism, isn't that things are so much about the battle between light and dark, but more about the understanding of the way. We might say something like it's more about us dying to ourselves and being born in a deeper reality which takes charge. It almost overcomes the good and bad. Now, that's not saying that good and bad don't exist. That's not saying nothing that you do matters. That's all very relevant on one level. But it's coming back to that source energy, the line between the yin and yang, if you will, the masculine and the feminine, the light and the dark. Now, this is very easy to understand when we just look at our own lives. I mean, who among us can say that we're perfect? Sure, some of us are worse than others, some of us are better than others, but not one of us can say that we act perfectly. That's been true all of our lives up to now. It will be true for the rest of our lives. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to act on anger sometimes. We're going to be fearful. Maybe we'll do something unjust. The question isn't, do we do these things or not? Of course, we should try and mitigate negative behaviour. The point is, how do we deal with these things when they happen? And that's the real Christian way, if you will. It's having the openness, the authenticity for us to accept when we misstepped, when we sinned, we erred, we got something wrong. And it's also having the wisdom to let go to a divine guidance that can guide us through life better than we could ourselves. And this goes back to Jung's critique, because he felt, especially in Western Protestant Christianity, Christ's perfection denied, or at least our interpretation of Christ's perfection denied the darker elements of life, and that led to repression. That's a very good point, I think. But again, when we understand Christ's journey mystically, we have to understand two key things. Christ the person isn't as important as what he is pointing towards. That's number one. And number two, Christ's perfection was also paid for by his suffering. So, Christ paid the ultimate price. He descended into hell. So we can't say he avoided darkness. He was tortured on a cross to the point of saying, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" That means he had to be broken down to that level. Now, when we understand that, we can understand the nature of what's often termed the dark night of the soul. For the soul to truly transcend the good-bad dynamic, to truly come in to what's true, we have to go through this period of extreme challenge. And that will be different for all of us. It's very unlikely you're going to have to be crucified, but each of us will be challenged at our deepest, our most sensitive, our most raw, our most pained. Now, again, you might look around the world and think, I don't see that happening to many people. Well, that's because the spiritual light isn't on. That's because they're just not been called. And those people can go and live their lives and enjoy themselves, and that's that. This is why I'm very interested in mysticism on the one side and the tradition on the other, because I believe the tradition is needed to guide those people with more institutional, basic direction. Whereas those who are drawn to the mystic path, they've got to find out for real, why we have to live by the norms that we do in our culture. And they're going to have to translate that, to the next generation. This is why it's a tragedy our religious and spiritual structures are breaking down, because there's no one to transmit that. However, as I say, that will lead to the rebirth. That's the silver lining. Now, the core point I'm getting to here is, far from it being this broken reality where everything is always damned because we try and be perfect, what we have to try and understand is we are living in a broken world where you can't avoid the dark. You can't avoid the light either. A lovely Leonard Cohen lyric on that. Even damnation is poisoned with rainbows. It's a good line. It's the opposite of a snake in the Garden of Eden. You can't escape a bit of darkness in perfect light, and you can't escape a bit of light in perfect darkness. Not in physical reality. Now, once we accept that, we understand that we as limited individual selves are going to have to navigate that the best way we can. Understanding that we're not perfect, but being willing to open up to what is perfection, which is beyond this world, in order to correct us and guide us. Now, this brings us to the really key point of this video, and I think what the West has forgotten, and that's the journey of integration. This is where we would start to acknowledge these darker instincts within us. If you're serious about spiritual work, you're going to have to go there. It's not all fairies and praying on a rock in Bali, like much of the advertising that you get. This is really big in the New Age scene these days. I'm wary of the New Age scene for the reasons I've already laid out. It tends to be, popular with women. It's very soft. Amazing spirituality is in there, don't get me wrong. Some really powerful non-dual teachings. But the problem is, it's all sweet. It's all lightness. It's all spiritual bypassing. Don't worry about that darkness. And then very often they politicize that as well. Donald Trump is the ego. Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders, they're effectively the Jedi, and that'll be the way they see it. And of course, they don't see that they're just creating a new dualism. Light and dark don't run down political lines. We're still in our dualistic ego mindset if we think along those lines. Doesn't mean you can't have your views, doesn't mean you can't say what you think is true, but we have to understand it's deeper than the simple binary. And if we think it is, we're trapped once more in dualistic thinking. However, if we're willing to step beyond that, this is where integration begins, and that begins with us. We have to look at our own biases. I have to say to some people who reach out to me on the other channel, you by all means disagree with people, by all means have your own views, but be wary of pathologizing everyone who disagrees with you. There's a certain famous psychologist who's falling into this trap at the moment. Just because people disagree with you doesn't mean they're necessarily ill or evil. Sometimes they might be. Of course that might be true. Sometimes we might be too. But the broader point is, we have to be able to resonate with what's the true energy of an individual, not ideology, not human ego. And then we're truly integrating. We're moving beyond the dualistic realm, Now, this is a problem, again, with the Enlightenment crowd. It's almost like trying to become all light, the Jedi, if you will. But that's not real reality. Reality on the ground is always going to have that interplay between the darkness and light, and what we are the neutral observers of it, Now, we can, again, say what we think is true, but more broadly speaking, we're understanding the reality is bigger than ourselves. And our process in understanding that begins with the shadow work, the confessional work. Where's my darkness? Where's my sin? Where's my pain? What have I done that's deeply wrong and harming me, hurting me? What have I denied? Who hurt me? Who abused me? Who wounded me? All those big questions that sit at the root of our souls. And if we're gifted to feel their pain and be able to see them, we will truly grow and you'll embrace the real spiritual path. If people don't do that, fine, that's up to them, but they'll always have the institutional religious side. It'll just be another argument, another position they'll take. But I wouldn't argue with them. Leave them to it. Let them have it. Let them enjoy themselves. And this leads us to the next point. We then move from the integration, which is really a small self. You could say that's Richard. Richard, the small self, needs to integrate his dark feelings, his traumas, so on and so on. But the next level to that is realization. And this goes beyond good and evil. Now, those of you who know philosophy will know that's a famous book by Nietzsche. We'll get to that in a minute. But I'm not talking to Nietzsche's ideas here. Nietzsche almost said deny Christian morality, go beyond good and evil in order to evolve yourself, your own will to power, become great, evolve spiritually and personally via your own mad drive, to better yourself. And in a sense, you could say there's a bit of Nietzsche in someone like Tate, in a way. But this isn't what we're talking to here. It's not about the individual overcoming. This is the opposite. This is the individual letting go. This is the journey of the mystic. And this is where we realize that the true nature isn't the interplay between good and evil, because we can't truly understand good and evil. We can understand pastiches of it, but we can't understand it in its totality. Many examples from all of our lives where we think we're doing the wrong thing, but we may realize down the line we were doing the wrong thing. If you ever change your mind about anything, you'll know that to be true. Now, this should give us pause for thought and contemplation, but it's an aperture through which we can open the door to that true realization, which is the real reality, the God nature, the line between the yin and yang. This is the lovely line. I think it's in Ephesians, is it maybe? I live not, but Christ lives in me, or God lives in me if you prefer, or life lives in me. If we can move beyond the small self, the egoic layer, what we will find is a deeper resonance with reality. And again, that would be a direct challenge to Nietzsche. I would say Nietzsche's path will lead to massive, massive results quickly, but it will destroy everything in time. This path of letting go is ultimately what we need to get to in order to make wiser, more sane decisions about our individual lives, but also collectively as a culture, but even more fundamentally, to come to the true reality of life. It's not so much about enlightenment as it is about realizing the true nature. And remember, enlightenment can very often be a tool to guide people down the wrong roads anyway. Now, I believe we as individuals need to open up to this path, but our culture does as well. If not, I think we will perish, because we need that light shining through the mystic heart back into the core of our culture. Now, this won't appeal to everyone. It will be a niche few, but those few will be the beacons that will guide the society, that will reawaken the vibrancy and brilliance of the tradition. Of course, this is the work that I'm starting to aim towards. On my Substack, I will hold a free course soon about that, the individual work of beginning this process. So do join the Substack for that. There will be more information soon. And do let me know your thoughts down below. And I do look forward to connecting at some point down the line. Do take care.